The chill that ran through my body had nothing to do with the autumn air and everything to do with the look in my son's eyes. He stood on the porch, my grandson Michael just a toddler on his hip, and he didn't even ask me to come inside. "Mom, now's really not a good time," David said, his voice a low, steady wall of dismissal. Behind him, I could see my daughter-in-law, Linda, hovering in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a silent sentinel of my exclusion. That was the last time I saw my son's face for 10 years. The argument that led to it seems so foolish now, a spark that ignited a forest fire of resentment. It was about money, of course, the thing that tears more families apart than anything else. David and Linda wanted to buy a new SUV, a fancy one with all the bells and whistles, and they'd ask me for a loan, a word that in our family always meant a gift they'd eventually forget they'd received. I said no. I'd worked my fingers to the bone my whole life, first at the diner, then managing the office at the auto body shop, and finally, after Robert passed, making do with his small pension and my Social Security. That money was my security, my "don't bury me in a cardboard box" fund. I told David I couldn't risk it, not for a car. But the truth, I was too proud to say, was that I was tired of being the family bank, tired of the constant requests that felt more like expectations. Linda had called me selfish. David had said I didn't understand the pressures of a young family. The words escalated, old grievances were dragged into the light, and by the end of that terrible phone call, he told me not to come over anymore. And I, with a pride as stubborn as my German grandmother's, had listened. I packed a single suitcase, left a note from my landlord, and bought a one-way bus ticket to a little town in Oregon where my late sister's friend had a rental cottage. I thought a week, maybe 2. I thought he'd cool off. He didn't call. The silence stretched, a vast, empty canyon between us, and my heart hardened with every passing month. I sent letters to Michael, care of David, for his birthdays. I never knew if he got them. I'd picture my son, my David who used to fall asleep on my lap after scraping his knee, opening the envelope, his face a mask of disgust, before tossing it in the trash. That image, whether it was true or not, kept me away. It fed the story I told myself. I was no longer his mother. I was a problem he'd solved. I built a new, quiet life by the sea, a life of solitary walks on the beach and volunteering at the local library. A life where the only heart I had to worry about was my own. But a mother's heart is never truly her own, is it? It's always beating in a chest miles away in a home you're no longer welcome in. The call came on a Tuesday, the kind of damp, gray day that made my old bones ache. It wasn't David's voice on the other end, but a woman's, soft and hesitant. "Grandma Helen?" she said. And for a moment I was confused, the title feeling foreign and misplaced. It was Sarah, Michael's fiancée. She'd found my number through a cousin, a secret sleuth on a mission of mercy. She told me Michael was getting married. She told me he'd always wondered about me, about the grandmother who sent letters with pressed wildflowers from a place he'd never seen. She told me, her voice dropping to a whisper, that she wanted him to have his whole family there. His father, David, he might not be happy, she warned, but this is Michael's day, and he wants you there. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the phone. The invitation arrived a week later, a thick, creamy envelope that felt like a verdict in my hands. I stared at it for a full day, perched on my coffee table like a sleeping bomb. Going back meant facing the wreckage I'd run from. It meant seeing the hurt in David's eyes, or worse, the indifference. It meant risking a very public rejection. But not going meant missing my only grandson's wedding. It meant letting that 10-year silence become my entire future. So I booked a flight. I bought a new dress, a simple lavender shift that my sister's friend said made me look softer. I practiced what I would say in the mirror. "Hello, David. It's been a long time." The words always sounded hollow, a pathetic script for a scene I couldn't possibly direct. The wedding was at a vineyard, all rolling green hills and perfectly manicured rows of grapes. It was so beautiful, it hurt. I stood at the edge of the ceremony site, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scanned the crowd, a sea of pastel dresses and smart suits, and then I saw them. David. His hair was thinner, grayer at the temples, and he'd put on some weight. He looked like my Robert in his later years, and the resemblance stole my breath. He was laughing at something Linda was saying, her hand resting possessively on his arm. And next to them, a young man. No, a man. So handsome and tall, it made my eyes prickle with tears. Michael. My Michael? He had my David's smile, the same one I'd kissed 1,000 times when he was a boy. He hadn't seen me yet. The string quartet began to play, and everyone took their seats. I found an empty chair in the very last row, hidden partially by a large oak tree. I watched my grandson marry his Sarah, my vision blurring as they exchanged vows, promises of forever that felt so fragile and brave. I was a ghost at my own family's feast, a secret shame sitting in the back. And then it was over. The crowd erupted in applause, the new husband and wife turned, beaming, and as they began their joyful walk back up the aisle, Michael's eyes, scanning the happy faces of his guests, landed on mine. His smile didn't fade. It didn't twist into confusion or anger. It just held. His steps slowed for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible hesitation that I, his grandmother, felt in my very soul. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and in that single, unguarded moment, his face showed not rejection, but a dawning, heartbreaking recognition. Then he was swept away by the crowd, and the moment was gone. But it was enough. That one look was a crack in the wall of my loneliness, a tiny, fragile thread thrown across a decade of silence. The reception was a whirl of laughter and clinking glasses under a vast white tent, and I felt like a stone lodged in a rushing river, unmoving and out of place. I found a small, isolated table in the far corner, partly shrouded by a draped swag of fabric, and claimed it as my refuge. From there I could watch them, my family, a living portrait of everything I'd missed. David and Linda were at the main table with the wedding party, and I saw how Linda's hand would occasionally dart out to adjust David's tie or smooth his hair, a gesture of ownership that felt like a deliberate message to me. Every time David laughed, a real deep-throated laugh at something the best man said, a little piece of my heart would break off and wither. He was happy. He had been happy all this time without me. The narrative I'd clung to for a decade, that he was stubborn, that he was being controlled by Linda, that he was miserable in his righteousness, crumbled into dust. His happiness was the final, absolute rejection. I was preparing to slip away, to call a cab and retreat back to the airport, to my quiet life by the sea, when a shadow fell over my table. I looked up, and my breath caught. It was Michael. He stood there, his new wife Sarah a step behind him, her face a mixture of gentle encouragement and nervous anticipation. "Grandma Helen?" he said, and the sound of that name on his lips, here, in this moment, was more shocking than any anger could have been. I could only nod, my throat sealed shut by a decade of unshed tears. I saw you during the ceremony," he continued, his voice soft, laced with a wonder that undid me. "I wasn't sure it was really you, but it is." He took a tentative step closer. "This is my wife, Sarah." Sarah gave me a warm, genuine smile. "It's so good to finally meet you, Helen. Thank you for coming." Her kindness was a balm and a torment. I wouldn't have missed it," I managed to whisper, the words scraping raw against my throat. Michael's gaze was intense, searching my face as if looking for the ghost of the grandmother he'd known as a toddler. "I got your letters," he said quietly, and the world narrowed to just his words. "The one with the pressed organ iris is still in my baby book. Mom didn't know I kept them."
The revelation was a seismic shift in the landscape of my heart. Linda hadn't thrown them away. David hadn't intercepted them.
My grandson had cherished them. For 10 years, a secret thread had connected us, and I never knew. Just then, a presence materialized beside Michael. David. His face was a carefully composed mask, but his eyes, the same shade of hazel as my own, were stormy. "Michael, Sarah, the photographers are waiting for you by the vineyard arches," he said, his voice clipped and tight, deliberately ignoring my existence. "You should go now." Michael looked from his father to me, a flicker of conflict in his young eyes. "Dad, I was just talking to—" "I see who you're talking to," David cut him off, his jaw rigid. "The photographers. Now, son." It was the son that did it, the proprietary tone, the reminder of where Michael's primary loyalty lay. Sarah gently touched Michael's arm, and with one last apologetic glance in my direction, he allowed himself to be led away. I was left alone at the table with my son. The air between us crackled with a decade's worth of unsaid words. He didn't sit. He just stood there, looking down at me, and I felt every one of my 72 years. "Why are you here, Mother?" he finally asked, the word mother sounding like a clinical term, devoid of warmth. "I was invited," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of the strength I used to wield. "By Michael's fiancée." "Sarah doesn't understand the history," he said, his lips a thin line. "She shouldn't have gone behind my back." "She did it for him, David, because he wanted me here." He flinched, as if the idea was physically painful. "You can't just waltz back in after 10 years and pretend nothing happened." "I'm not pretending," I hissed, leaning forward, careful to keep my voice low. "I lived with what happened every single day. But I am here for my grandson, not for you. You made it abundantly clear 10 years ago that you had no use for me." His composure cracked, just for a second. "You chose your money over your family," he shot back, the old wound gaping open, raw and bleeding. "It was never about the money, David," I pleaded, desperate for him to see, to understand the fear that had driven me. "It was about being seen as a wallet and not a person. It was about being afraid I'd have nothing left at the end." "We were your family," he said, his voice rising enough that a few people at a nearby table glanced over. He lowered it again, a harsh whisper. "We were supposed to be your security, but you walked away. You got on a bus and you left." And there it was, the core of it. Not the money, not the SUV. It was my departure. To him, my leaving wasn't an act of self-preservation. It was the ultimate betrayal, an abandonment that dwarfed any financial disagreement. He saw my pride as a weapon I'd used against him. Before I could form a response, he turned on his heel. "Stay out of my way," he said over his shoulder, the words a final, cold dismissal. "Enjoy the cake, then leave." I watched him walk back to his wife, who immediately put a comforting hand on his back and shot a look of pure venom in my direction. I sat there trembling, the ghost of my son's hurt hanging in the air around me. I had been so right, and yet I had been so terribly, tragically wrong.
The clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation seemed to swell, pressing in on me from all sides, a joyous noise that felt like mockery. I watched David return to his seat, his shoulders set in a hard, unforgiving line, and Linda leaned in to whisper something to him, her eyes cutting toward me once more. I was the infection in their perfect day, and the urge to flee, to simply vanish back into the forgotten years I'd come from, was a physical pull. I started to gather my purse, my hands shaking, ready to make my quiet escape. But then I saw Michael. He was standing with Sarah near the dance floor, his head bent toward hers, but his gaze was fixed on me. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a plea in his eyes. "Don't go." It was that simple, silent communication that rooted me to my chair. My grandson, the man I barely knew, was asking me to stay. For him, I would endure 1,000 of David's cold shoulders. The band started up, a soft, melodic tune for the first dance, and as Michael led his new wife onto the floor, a fresh wave of emotion washed over me. He was so young, so full of hope, his entire life a clean, bright slate before him. He had no idea how long a decade could be, how deeply a silence could carve itself into your soul. I saw David and Linda join them on the floor, a picture of parental pride, and the ache in my chest intensified. I should have been up there too. Robert should have been there. Our family was a broken constellation, missing stars, and the empty spaces were all I could see. The dances continued, father-daughter, mother-son, and I watched David and Linda share a dance with Michael, a seamless, practiced unit. I was an observer, a ghost at the feast, just as I'd feared. As the music shifted to something more upbeat and the dance floor filled with guests, I decided I needed air or I would suffocate. I slipped out of the tent, walking toward a quiet grove of trees that bordered the vineyard. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and the beauty of it was a sharp contrast to the turmoil inside me. I leaned against the rough bark of an old oak, closing my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't hear him approach. He kept the letters in a shoebox under his bed. The voice, so close, made me jump. It was Sarah. She stood a few feet away, her white dress glowing in the twilight, her expression kind and concerned. When we were packing up his childhood room to move in together, I found it. He sat on the floor and read every single one of them to me. He cried, Helen. Her words landed like physical blows, each one reopening a wound I thought had scarred over. I never knew why you left, David just told you you had a disagreement and that you needed your space. He made it sound like a mutual thing, a quiet drifting apart. But Michael always knew there was more to it. A kid knows. I wrapped my arms around myself, a feeble defense against the onslaught of truth. David said I abandoned them. Maybe you did, Sarah said softly, not with accusation, but with a startling clarity. And maybe David made it impossible for you to stay. Family, it's never just one person's fault, is it? It's a tangled mess of hurt feelings and stubbornness and love that gets twisted into something ugly. She took a step closer. Michael asked me to find you.
He was afraid to do it himself, afraid of his father's reaction, afraid you wouldn't come. But he wanted you here more than anything. He needs to know you. And, she added, her voice dropping, I think he needs you to know him. Before I could respond, we heard the muffled sound of a microphone being tapped. They're starting the toasts, Sarah said. You should come back in, for Michael. I nodded, unable to speak, and followed her back toward the tent. We entered just as David was stepping up to the podium, a champagne flute in his hand. The crowd quieted, all smiles and expectant faces. My son cleared his throat, and his eyes swept over the room, briefly passing over me without a flicker of recognition, before settling on Michael and Sarah. Michael, he began, his voice thick with emotion. My son, from the moment you were born, you filled my life with a light I never knew was missing. He spoke of childhood baseball games, of teaching him to drive, of the pride he felt watching him become a man. Each word was a loving dagger in my heart. This was the father he had been, the father I remembered. This was the man I had lost. And Sarah, David continued, smiling at his new daughter-in-law, welcome to the family. We couldn't love you more if you were our own. The crowd applauded warmly. He raised his glass. To Michael and Sarah. The toast echoed through the tent, and as the cheers subsided, David made to step down. But then he paused, his hand tightening on the microphone. The room fell silent again, sensing a shift. He looked down, then directly at me,
his gaze a complex storm of pain and defiance. "Life doesn't always go the way you plan," he said, his voice losing its celebratory tone, becoming heavier, graver. "Families have their struggles, their distances." A nervous tension rippled through the guests. They felt it now, the unspoken drama playing out before them. "But today is a day for new beginnings. It's a day to remember what's important." He paused, and the silence was deafening. "And to let go of the things that are not." He gave a sharp, final nod and returned to his seat, leaving a void of stunned silence in his wake before the band quickly started up again to fill it. His words were a public execution, a letting go. He wasn't just toasting his son, he was officiating the final burial of his mother. I felt the eyes of the room on me, the subject of his cryptic, cutting eulogy. The heat of shame and a sudden, fierce anger burned through my veins. He had drawn a line in the sand, in front of everyone they knew, and I was firmly on the other side. The applause that followed David's toast felt like a physical force, a wave of complicity that pushed me deeper into my chair. Let go of the things that are not. The words echoed in my head, a cruel mantra. I was a thing that is not. I looked down at my hands, knotted together in my lap, the skin thin and mapped with blue veins, hands that had held him, fed him, bandaged his wounds. Now they were just old hands, useless and unwelcome. The urge to run was a primal scream in my blood, but my legs felt made of stone. To leave now would be to confirm his verdict, to accept my erasure. So I sat, a statue of shame, as the party swirled around me. I focused on the tiny, intricate pattern of the tablecloth, counting the threads, anything to keep from dissolving. Then, a gentle hand touched my shoulder. I flinched, expecting another confrontation. But it was Michael. He knelt beside my chair, his tuxedo jacket brushing the grass, putting his eyes level with mine. The music and laughter seemed to fade into a dull roar behind the intensity of his gaze. "Grandma," he said, his voice low and for my ears only, "I am so sorry. I didn't know he would do that." The apology, so sincere and undeserved, broke the dam inside me. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a path down my cheek before I could swiftly wipe it away. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Michael," I whispered, my voice thick. "This is your day, a beautiful day." "It's not beautiful if you're hurting," he said, and the simple kindness in that statement undid me more than any of David's barbs ever could. He looked so much like his father at that age, the same earnest worry in his brow, the same capacity for deep feeling. He's so angry," I managed to say, voicing the core of my confusion and pain. Michael sighed, a world-weary sound that seemed too old for his young face. "It's not just the money, Grandma. It never was. When you left, it was right after he'd lost his job at the engineering firm. Remember? He never told you. He was too proud. He felt like a failure. He asked you for the loan because he was desperate to keep up appearances, for us, for me. And when you said no, he felt like you were confirming his worst fear, that he wasn't a good provider, that he'd let everyone down. And then you left town. To him, it felt like you were abandoning him when he was at his lowest." The world tilted on its axis. The memory came rushing back, hazy but undeniable. David had been tense, withdrawn during that period. I'd asked if everything was okay, and he'd brushed me off with a terse, "Everything's fine, Mom, don't worry about it." I had thought he was just being his usual stressed self. I never knew. I had judged his request as frivolity when it was born of sheer desperation. The fight, my pride, my 10-year exile, it was all built on a foundation of things left unsaid. "He never told me," I breathed, the horror of this new understanding washing over me. "I didn't know, Michael. I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," he said, his hand still resting reassuringly on my arm. But he built a story around it, Grandma, a story where you didn't believe in him. And he's been living inside it for so long, I think he's afraid of what's outside. He looked over at his father, who was now laughing a little too loudly at something a relative was saying, a performative display of having moved on. He doesn't know I know about the job. Mom told me years later. Just then, Sarah joined us, slipping her hand into Michael's. The bouquet toss is next, she said softly, her eyes full of unspoken sympathy. Then she looked directly at me. Helen, would you like to join for the pictures? It was a peace offering, a small but significant gesture to include me in the ritual. Before I could decline, Michael stood, taking my hand. Come on, Grandma, for us. And so I found myself being gently guided to the edge of a gathering crowd of laughing, eager young women. I stood off to the side, feeling utterly absurd, a gray-haired woman in a lavender dress amidst a sea of youth. Sarah stood on the steps of the terrace, her back to the crowd, a beautiful smile on her face. She scanned the group, her eyes meeting mine for a brief conspiratorial moment. Then she tossed the bouquet. It sailed through the air in a high, graceful arc, bypassing the outstretched hands of a dozen girls, and as if guided by some unseen force, it landed squarely, softly, in my arms. I caught it on pure reflex, the bundle of white roses and baby's breath a shocking weight against my chest. A stunned silence fell for a split second, followed by a wave of confused, then delighted laughter and applause. I stood frozen, clutching the flowers, my face burning. I looked up and across the lawn. David was staring, his glass halted halfway to his lips. The mask of casual indifference was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unvarnished shock. In that one unguarded moment, I didn't see anger. I saw the ghost of the boy I remembered, bewildered by a world he couldn't control. The spell was broken when a young cousin giggled and shouted, "Looks like you're next, Grandma." The crowd laughed again, good-naturedly, and the moment passed. But the image of David's face was seared into my mind. The bouquet in my hands felt less like a joke and more like a symbol, a stubborn, blooming sign that perhaps my story here wasn't entirely over. The laughter around me felt distant, muffled, as if I were hearing it from underwater. The bouquet of roses in my hands was a stark white accusation. I could feel the weight of David's stare from across the lawn, a laser of confusion and something else, something that looked unsettlingly like hurt, burning into me. I gently, almost reverently set the flowers down on my empty chair. Their purpose served in creating a moment so absurd it had momentarily shattered the icy facade between us. My heart was still hammering, a frantic, wild bird against my ribs, and a sudden dizziness washed over me. The emotion, the confrontation, the sheer weight of the day had become too much. The world tilted on its axis, the vibrant greens and blues of the vineyard blurring into a nauseating swirl. I reached out a hand to steady myself on the back of the chair, my knees buckling slightly. It was David who caught me. I don't know how he moved so fast. One moment he was a statue across the lawn, and the next, his arm was around my shoulders, his hand gripping my elbow, holding me upright. His touch was firm, unfamiliar after so long, and it sent a jolt through my system. "Mom?" The word was out of his mouth before he could stop it, a stripped-bare, involuntary sound that was entirely different from the cold "mother" he'd used earlier. It was the voice he'd used as a little boy, scared of a thunderstorm. "Are you all right? Sit down." He guided me back into the chair, his movements brisk, practical, but his touch was careful. He knelt in front of me, just as Michael had, his face level with mine, and for the first time in 10 years, I was truly looking at my son. I saw the fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, the faint weathering of his skin, the flecks of gray in his stubble. He wasn't the furious man from the porch, or the stern father from the toast. He was just a man, worried about his mother. I'm fine, David," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just A little lightheaded. It's been a long day. He didn't move away. He stayed there, kneeling on the grass, his hazel eyes searching mine, and the wall between us felt, for a breathtaking second, as thin as glass. The noise of the reception faded into insignificance. "You need some water," he stated, his voice low. He gestured to a passing waiter, who promptly brought a crystal glass. David took it and handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine. The simple, mundane act of him giving me a glass of water felt more intimate and monumental than any embrace could have. "Thank you," I said, taking a small sip. The cool liquid was a balm. He didn't respond. He just watched me drink, a tumult of unspoken thoughts raging behind his eyes. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was thick, charged, full of the ghosts of 1,000 lost conversations. He was remembering, as I was, all the times he'd been sick as a boy and I'd brought him ginger ale in bed, how I'd feel his forehead with the back of my hand. The roles were reversed now, and the symbolism was not lost on either of us. "David," I began, my voice barely a whisper, seizing this fragile, unexpected opening. "What Michael told me about the job, I never knew. You have to believe me. If I had known you were in such trouble—" He looked away, his jaw tightening, the shutters starting to come down again. "It doesn't matter now." "It does matter," I insisted, a surge of desperate energy giving me strength. "I thought I was teaching you a lesson about responsibility. I thought I was protecting myself. I was so blind. I failed you when you needed me." The admission cost me everything, laying my pride bare at his feet. He stood up abruptly, breaking the intense proximity, turning his back to me as he ran a hand through his hair. He was a silhouette against the setting sun. "You left," he said, the words flat, drained of their earlier fire, but heavy with a pain that had been festering for a decade. "You didn't call me, you didn't write to me, you just disappeared." "I was waiting for you to call me," I confessed, the truth of my own stubbornness finally laid bare. "I was so sure you would, and when you didn't, the silence just grew. It became a monster I didn't know how to slay." I took a deep, shaky breath. "I am so sorry, David, for all of it." He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, absorbing my words. The band struck up a slow, classic tune, and the MC announced the cutting of the cake. It was a signal, a shift back to the scheduled program of joy. David turned back to face me, his expression once again unreadable, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had appeared. "They're cutting the cake," he said, his voice neutral. You should come and watch." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't an embrace, but it was an invitation. It was the first time he had included me in anything. He didn't offer his arm, but he waited, standing a few feet away, as I slowly, carefully rose from my chair, and together, yet still apart, we walked toward the crowd gathering around the towering wedding cake, a delicate, sugar-spun monument to a new beginning, while we stood amidst the ruins of our own. The crowd around the cake was a warm, buzzing hive of joy, but David and I stood at its outer edge like two distinct cold fronts. The space between us, though only a few feet, felt vast and uncrossable, filled with the echoes of my apology and his stony silence. We watched as Michael and Sarah, their hands overlapping on the cake knife, shared a laughing, messy bite of frosting, their eyes locked in a private world of promise. It was a ritual of shared future, a stark contrast to the fractured past we were mired in. David's arms were crossed tightly over his chest, a defensive posture I remembered from his teenage years when he felt cornered or misunderstood. He was watching his son, but his entire being seemed tuned to my presence beside him, a low, uncomfortable hum of awareness. I could see the pulse beating rapidly at the base of his throat. The server began deftly slicing the cake and distributing pieces on delicate china plates. When one was offered to me, I took it with a murmured thanks, the sweet floral scent of the buttercream suddenly cloying. I had no appetite. David refused a plate with a quick, sharp shake of his head, his gaze still fixed ahead. Then, as if the act required immense physical effort, he uncrossed his arms and turned his head slightly toward me. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, meant only for me. "You look tired." It wasn't kindness. Not quite. It was an observation, clinical and detached, yet it was the first time he had acknowledged my existence as a physical being since catching me. "It's been a long day," I repeated my earlier, feeble excuse, my fingers tightening on the plate. "A long decade," he corrected softly, and the words hung in the air between us, immense and devastating. He wasn't just stating a fact. He was admitting that the time had weighed on him, too, that perhaps his happiness wasn't as absolute as I had imagined. Before I could form a response, Linda materialized at his side, slipping her arm through his with a proprietary ease that felt like a territorial claim. "David, the Coopers are leaving. They want to say goodbye," she said, her voice bright and social, her eyes skimming over me as if I were part of the scenery. "Of course," he said, his posture immediately shifting, the moment of raw connection severed. He allowed himself to be led away without a backward glance, back into his role as the gracious father of the groom. I stood there, holding the untouched piece of cake, the phantom warmth of his brief concern already fading. I was adrift again. I found my way back to my solitary table, the bouquet of roses a silent monument to the bizarre turn the evening had taken. I watched the rest of the reception unfold from a distance, the dancing growing more exuberant, the laughter more raucous as the night deepened and the champagne flowed. I was a spectator to my own family's life. After a while, I noticed Michael and Sarah making their rounds, saying their goodbyes. Their departure was imminent. My time was up. I knew I couldn't face another painful, formal goodbye with David. Seeing Michael, having that one real conversation with him, had to be enough. It would have to sustain me for another decade, or perhaps for the rest of my life. I decided to slip out quietly, just as I had planned to do hours ago. I gathered my purse and stood, my body aching with a profound weariness. I took one long last look at the scene, the twinkling lights, the dancing figures, my son standing with his wife, and turned to leave. "Grandma, you're not leaving, are you?" Michael's voice stopped me. He and Sarah were there, their coats on, looking flushed and happy, and a little sad. "It's time for me to go," I said, trying to smile. "It was a beautiful wedding. I'm so happy I got to see it. To see you." "We're so glad you came," Sarah said, and she stepped forward and hugged me. It was a genuine, warm embrace that nearly brought me to my knees. When she pulled away, her eyes were shiny. Michael looked over my shoulder, a conflicted expression on his face. "Did you talk to Dad?" he asked hesitantly. "A little," I say. "It's a start." It was a lie of hope, a narrative I chose to believe for his sake, and for mine. Michael nodded, understanding. "We're going to be in Oregon for a few days next month, for the honeymoon. We'd love to see you, if you'd like that." They wanted to visit, in my new home. The offer was so generous, so full of potential, it stole my breath. "I would like that very much," my voice cracking. Michael hugged me then, a strong, solid embrace that felt like a promise. "I'll call you," he whispered in my ear. And then they were gone, whisked away in a shower of sparklers and cheers, off to begin their life together. The party began to dissolve around me. I saw David and Linda near the exit, thanking their guests. I knew I had to walk past them to get to the taxi. There was no avoiding it. My heart pounded as I approached. Linda saw me first, her smile freezing into a polite, brittle mask. David's eyes met mine. He looked exhausted, the events of the day finally etching themselves visibly onto his face. There was a long, awkward pause. "I'm heading to my hotel," I said, my voice unnaturally calm. Linda gave a tight nod. "Safe travels." David said nothing. He just looked at me, his expression an unreadable tapestry of old hurt and new confusion. Then, as I moved to pass, he spoke, his voice so low I almost missed it. "Your piece of cake." I stopped, confused. "What?" "You never ate your piece of cake," he said, his eyes holding mine. It was such an insignificant detail, yet him noticing it, him remembering it felt profoundly significant. It meant that he had been watching me, even when he seemed oblivious. It meant that for all his anger, he was still, in some small, fractured way, my son. I didn't know what to say. I just gave a small, helpless shrug. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and I walked away, into the cool night air, leaving him standing there, the unspoken words about an uneaten piece of cake hanging between us like a fragile, lingering thread.
The cab ride back to the hotel was a blur of streaking streetlights and a silence so heavy it felt like a third passenger. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, the events of the evening replaying in a chaotic loop behind my eyes, David's hand catching my arm, the word "mom" escaping his lips, the shocking weight of the bouquet, the devastating revelation about the lost job, the uneaten piece of cake. Each moment was a stone dropped into the still pond of my resigned heart, sending out ripples that disturbed everything I thought I knew. I had gone to the wedding braced for a final, clean break, a surgical amputation of a limb that had been necrotic for years. Instead, I was leaving with a messy, open wound, raw and throbbing with a confusing mixture of pain and a perilous, fragile hope. The hotel room was sterile and anonymous, a stark contrast to the vibrant, emotional chaos of the wedding. I slipped off my new shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, the stiff bedspread scratchy under my hands. I replayed the moment David knelt in front of me. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a crack. For 10 years, I had believed his heart was a solid, impenetrable fortress. Now I knew it had a fault line, and I had just felt the tremors. I thought the ache of missing him would be the hardest part, but this was worse. This was the agony of possibility. The phone on the nightstand rang, shattering the quiet. My heart leaped into my throat, a foolish, instinctual hope. Could it be David? I picked it up, my hand trembling. "Hello?" "Grandma, it's Michael." The voice was warm, familiar now. "We're at the airport hotel. I wanted to make sure you got back all right." The kindness in his voice, the simple act of checking on me, unleashed the tears I'd been fighting all day. I choked them back, swallowing hard. "I'm fine, Michael. Thank you for calling. It was a beautiful day." "It was," he agreed, and I heard the smile in his voice. "And Sarah wasn't kidding. We've already looked at the map. We'll be driving down the coast in about 3 weeks. We'd really like to stop by, see where you live." "I'd like that," I said. And this time the words were steady, filled with a genuine warmth that spread through my cold limbs. "I'll make you lunch." We talked for a few more minutes, easy, light conversation about their travel plans,
the beauty of the Oregon coast, a world away from the strained tensions of the wedding. When I hung up, the sterile room didn't feel quite so empty. There was a thread, a real one, connecting me to the future. I changed out of my wedding clothes, the lavender dress now feeling like a costume from a play I was no longer sure how to act in. As I lay in the dark, unable to sleep, my mind kept circling back to the cake. You never ate your piece of cake? Why had he noticed that? Why had he cared? In the grand theater of our family tragedy, it was a trivial piece of stage dressing. But to him, in that moment, it had mattered. It was a detail, a small, silent observation that proved he was still watching, still seeing me, even through the thick fog of his anger. It was a single, stubborn green shoot pushing through the frozen, barren ground of our relationship. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And after a decade of nothing, something felt like everything.
The morning light in my Oregon cottage was soft and gray, filtered through a gentle marine layer that clung to the coastline. The silence here was different from the silence I'd endured for a decade back east. This one was peaceful, filled with the rhythmic crash of waves and the cries of gulls. But today, it felt heavy. Returning felt like stepping back into a life that no longer quite fit. The wedding had changed the shape of me, of my history. And the familiar walls of my small home seemed to lean in, asking silent questions I didn't have the answers to. I put the kettle on, the mundane ritual grounding me, and my eyes fell on the small, framed photograph on my kitchen windowsill. It was of David and me, taken on his graduation day, his arms slung around my shoulders, both of us squinting into the sun, his smile bright and unburdened. I touched the cold glass over his youthful face. The man at the wedding was a stranger built around the bones of that boy. The revelation about the job loss was a ghost that had followed me home, haunting my every thought. How different would our lives have been if he'd just told me? If I'd just looked past my own pride and seen his desperation? The what-ifs were a torturous, endless loop. A week passed, then another. I jumped every time the phone rang, a part of me still hoping, against all reason, that it would be David, his voice softened by time and distance. It never was. But the call from Michael came, just as he promised. His voice was a burst of sunshine on a cloudy day. They'd arrived on the coast and were heading my way. A nervous energy seized me. I cleaned the cottage from top to bottom, baked a lemon poppy seed cake, David's favorite when he was a boy, and arranged a bowl of seashells I'd collected on my walks as a centerpiece for the table. I was setting a stage, trying to create a perfect picture of the life I'd built without them, a life I suddenly found desperately wanting. When their rental car pulled into the gravel drive, my heart hammered against my ribs. I watched from the window as Michael helped Sarah out, both of them dressed in cozy sweaters and jeans, looking so young and so in love it made my chest ache. He looked around, taking in the wild, overgrown garden, the simple blue cottage, the view of the relentless gray ocean beyond. Then he turned and saw me at the window, and his face broke into a wide, unreserved smile. That smile was a balm. I met them at the door, and Sarah immediately enveloped me in another one of her wonderful, generous hugs. Michael's embrace was longer this time, more solid. "This place is amazing, Grandma," he said, his voice full of genuine awe as he stepped inside, his eyes taking in the bookshelves, the rocking chair by the fireplace, the wall of family photos that conspicuously skipped a decade. "It's so you." We sat at the small kitchen table, eating cake and drinking tea, and for the first hour it was easy. They told me stories from the first leg of their honeymoon, about a hike through a redwood forest and a quirky diner they'd found. The conversation was light, filled with laughter. I learned that Sarah was a teacher, that Michael was working in graphic design. I hung on every word, building a new image of my grandson, piece by precious piece.
But the shadow of his father was in the room with us, a presence as tangible as the salt air. Finally, Michael set his mug down, his expression growing more serious. "I talked to Dad yesterday," he said, and the air in the room stilled. He asked where we were going today. My breath caught. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that we were coming to see you." He paused, watching my reaction. He was quiet for a long time. Then he just said, Tell her I hope the cake is better there." I stared at him, the strange, cryptic message settling over me. Tell her I hope the cake is better there. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't anger. It was an acknowledgement, a reference to our shared painful moment. It was him reaching out a hand, however tentatively, from 2 states away. It was him saying, "I remember. I'm still here." I looked down at my half-eaten slice of lemon poppy seed cake and felt a single hot tear splash onto the plate. It was a seed of something. Not a forest, not even a tree, but a single, stubborn seed planted in the rocky, unforgiving soil of our past, and for the first time in 10 long years, I dared to hope it might grow.
The quiet after Michael and Sarah's rental car disappeared down the coastal road was profound. The cottage, which had felt so filled with light and life moments before, seemed to exhale a deep, lonely breath. I cleared the teacups and cake plates, my hands moving automatically, but my mind was 1,000 miles away, trapped in the echo of David's message. "Tell her I hope the cake is better there." It was the most David-like thing he could have said. Not flowery, not sentimental, but practical, grounded, and layered with a meaning only the two of us could fully decipher. He wasn't talking about the dessert. He was talking about my life. He was acknowledging, in his own stilted way, that the piece of cake at his table had been inedible for me, that I had been starving at his son's wedding, and he was expressing a hope, however faint, that my life here, at this table, was more nourishing. It was a monumental shift from the man who had told me to stay out of his way. For days, the message played on a loop in my head. I'd be pulling weeds in the garden or sorting books at the library, and the words would return, each time revealing a new, subtle nuance. It was an olive branch wrapped in sandpaper. It was an invitation to what? To write back? To call? The fear was paralyzing. What if I called and the wall was back up? What if his voice was cold again? The fragile seed of hope he'd planted felt too delicate to expose to the harsh elements of reality. I decided to write a letter. It felt safer, a throwback to the letters I'd sent Michael, a medium that allowed for thought and revision, for measuring out emotion in careful teaspoons instead of an uncontrollable flood. I sat at my small desk, the sound of the waves my only companion, and stared at the blank page for a long time. How do you bridge a chasm that took 10 years to carve? I started with the cake. "Dear David, the cake is much better here. I baked a lemon poppy seed one, the kind you used to love when you were 10 and would come home from school with scraped knees and a bottomless stomach. I wrote about the cottage, about the way the fog settled in the mornings, about my quiet life. I didn't apologize again. I had already done that. Instead, I simply described my world to him, as if he were a traveler from a distant land who knew nothing of its customs. I told him about Michael and Sarah's visit, how good it was to see him, how proud I was of the man he'd become. "You and Linda raised a wonderful son," I wrote, and the words were both a compliment and an admission of my own absence from that process. Then I took a breath and addressed the ghost at the feast. "Michael told me about the job you lost. I am so sorry I didn't see it, David. I am so sorry you felt you couldn't tell me. I was your mother, and I should have been a safe harbor, not another storm to weather." I didn't justify my actions. I simply acknowledged his truth. I sealed the envelope, addressed it, and walked to the post office before I could lose my nerve. Dropping it into the dark metal maw of the mailbox felt like sending a piece of my heart into the void. The wait that followed was agony.
Every day I watched for the mail truck, my stomach clenching as I sorted through the bills and flyers. A week passed. Then 2. The hope began to curdle into a familiar resignation. He wasn't going to respond. The message about the cape had been a momentary lapse, a flicker of sentimentality quickly extinguished by the cold reality of his enduring anger. I was in the backyard, stubbornly attacking a patch of stubborn blackberry vines, my hands scratched and dirty, trying to physically wrestle my disappointment into the ground, when my neighbor, Betty, called over the fence. "Helen, special delivery for you." She was holding a small rectangular box. My heart stopped. It wasn't from the post office. It was a courier package. I wiped my hands on my apron and took the box from her. It was heavy for its size. There was no return address, but the postmark was from my old hometown. My fingers fumbled as I untied the string and opened the cardboard flaps. Inside, nestled in crinkled brown paper, was a bakery box, and tucked beside it, a simple white note card. With trembling hands, I opened the card. The handwriting was his, unmistakably his, the same sharp, decisive script from the homework assignments I'd checked a lifetime ago. It held only 3 words. "So is mine." I lifted the lid of the bakery box. Inside, on a bed of wax paper, was a single, perfect, enormous slice of New York-style cheesecake, drenched in a glossy cherry compote. It was from the Golden Crumb, the bakery we'd gone to every Sunday after church when he was a boy, a place I thought had closed down decades ago. He'd found it. He'd gone there, and he'd set me a piece. I stood there in my sun-drenched, messy garden, holding the box, the sweet and tangy scent of cheesecake rising to meet me, and I wept. He wasn't ready for words. He wasn't ready for a phone call, but he was speaking to me in the only language he could manage, the language of memory, of a shared past, of a sweet, simple joy we had once known together. He was telling me that his cake was better now too, that his life had sweetness again, and in doing so, he was offering me a taste. The cheesecake sat on my kitchen counter like a sacred artifact, its presence both comforting and utterly unnerving. I left it there for a full day, looking at it every time I passed, the glossy red cherries seeming to darken under the kitchen light, the message on the card a constant low hum in my mind. So is mine. He was happy. Or, at least, his life had found a sweetness that had been missing back when he'd needed a loan for an SUV he couldn't afford. The finality in that statement should have been a closure, but it felt like anything but. It was a challenge, an invitation to a duel of healed wounds. "See? I'm fine without you." But the act of sending it, of seeking out that specific bakery from the dust of our past, screamed something else entirely. On the second day, I cut a small slice. The texture was perfect, dense and creamy, the cherry topping tart against the rich sweetness. It tasted like 100 Sunday afternoons, like Robert's laughter, like David's small, sticky hands. It tasted like a time when I knew my place in the world. I ate it slowly, letting the memories wash over me, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with a softer, more complex ache of longing. He was offering me a taste of his peace, and in doing so, he was reminding me of everything we had shared. I knew I couldn't respond with another letter. The cake demanded something more, something as visceral and wordless as his gesture had been. I thought about what I had that he might remember. What scent or taste could bridge the years as potently as that cheesecake had? And then I knew. The blackberry bushes at the edge of my property were heavy with fruit, fat and dark purple, almost black. When David was 9, we'd spent a whole Saturday in a similar patch near our old house, our arms scratched and stained, collecting berries for a cobbler. He'd eaten more than he'd put in the bucket, his mouth and chin a mess of purple juice, and he'd laughed with a pure, unguarded joy that I realized I hadn't seen in the years before I left. I spent the next morning picking, the thorns catching on my sleeves as if trying to hold me back. I made jam the way my own mother had taught me. Sugar and fruit and lemon juice. cooking it down until it thickened and the whole cottage smelled like sweetness and memory. I packed 2 jars carefully in a box, cushioning them with pages from an old newspaper. I didn't include a card. I didn't need to. He would understand. Sending that package felt riskier than the letter. It was more intimate, more primal. A week later, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was his. My hand shook as I picked it up. Hello? There was a pause, a breath on the other end of the line. The jam arrived. David's voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of the defensive edge he'd worn at the wedding. It was just his voice, the same one that had called for me in the night when he had a bad dream. The blackberries are good this year, I said, my own voice barely a whisper. They are, he agreed. Another silence, but this one wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken history of purple-stained hands and a hot kitchen decades ago. Linda? She spread some on her toast this morning. She said it was the best she's ever had. He was telling me she'd accepted it, that it was in his house, on his table. He was letting me in, just a crack. I'm glad, I said, tears welling in my eyes. We didn't talk long. There were no grand revelations, no sweeping ecologies. He told me about a project at his work. I told him about the storm that had knocked a branch off my favorite pine tree. It was small, safe talk, the kind of talk you have with someone you're just getting to know. But for us, it was everything. When we hung up, I sat for a long time, just holding the phone. The line of communication was open. It was fragile, tenuous as a spider silk, but it was there. He had called me. He had tasted the jam, a memory I had preserved and sent to him, and he had called to tell me it was good. It wasn't a reunion, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a conversation started in a language only we understood, a quiet, stubborn refusal to let the rest of our lives be defined by a single, terrible decade of silence. The thread between us, that single, fragile strand of a spider's web, held through the fall. Our conversations became a quiet ritual, never scheduled, never long, but consistently present. He would call on Sunday afternoons, often while puttering in his garage, and I'd be at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. We talked about the weather, about a movie he'd seen, about the persistent leak in my garden hose. It was all surface, a carefree skirting of the deep, rocky chasm that lay between us. But the mere fact of it was a miracle. I learned to listen to the spaces between his words, the slight hesitation when he mentioned Linda's name, the uncharacteristic warmth when he talked about Michael and Sarah's new apartment. I was relearning the map of my son, and he, I dared to hope, was rediscovering the sound of his mother's voice. The first frost was threatening when the phone rang on a Tuesday evening, breaking the pattern. It was David, but his voice was different, stripped of its casual ease, tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately place. "Mom," he said, and the word, still so rare from him, sent a jolt through me. "I'm here, David. It's Linda." He paused, and I could hear him struggling to compose himself. "She had a scare today. A mammogram. They found something. They need to do a biopsy." The world narrowed to the sound of his shaky breath on the other end of the line. All the petty grievances, the decade of silence, the hurt over money and pride, it evaporated into a cold, clarifying mist. My daughter-in-law, the woman who had viewed me as a threat, who had held my son's arms so possessively, was facing a fear that every woman knows, and my son was scared. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice steady and sure, the voice I used to use when he'd woken from a nightmare. "I don't know," he admitted, the confession sounding like it was torn from him. I had to tell you. That was the truth of it." In this moment of crisis, his first instinct, after all this time, had been to call me. He needed his mother. The dam of our formality broke. We talked for real then, about fear, about hospitals, about the agonizing wait for results. I didn't offer platitudes, I just listened. And in the listening, I could feel the little boy he'd been, the one who believed his mom could fix anything, reaching out in the dark. The next day, I didn't send a package or a card. I got on a plane. It was an impulsive, reckless act for a woman of my age and temperament, but it felt like the only thing to do. I landed in the late afternoon, rented a car, and drove straight to their house, the one I hadn't set foot in for over 10 years. My hands were clenched on the steering wheel as I pulled into the driveway, the same driveway where he'd told me it wasn't a good time. I walked to the door, my heart a wild drum in my chest, and rang the bell. David opened the door. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. He wasn't holding a toddler anymore. He was a middle-aged man, terrified for his wife. "Mom?" he breathed. "What are you doing here?" "You told me," I said simply, "so I came." I stepped inside, and the house was different, yet hauntingly familiar. The furniture was new, the paint colors updated, but the bones of it were the same. And then I saw Linda. She was sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, her face etched with a fear I knew all too well. She looked up at me, and her eyes, usually so guarded and sharp, were soft with vulnerability and surprise. "Helen," she said, her voice thin. I didn't hesitate. I walked over to the sofa and sat down beside her. I didn't try to hug her, the distance between us was too great for that. But I reached out and covered her hand with mine. Her fingers were ice cold. "I'm so sorry, Linda." And I meant it with every fiber of my being. "Whatever happens, you don't have to go through it alone." She looked down at our hands, then back up at my face, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't pull away. David was still standing by the door, watching us, his own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. In that quiet living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our past arguments and the palpable fear of the future, a new understanding was being born, not from words, but from a shared human fragility. The battlefield of our family was being cleared, not by a victor, but by a common enemy, and for the first time, we were standing on the same side.
The next 72 hours were a suspended animation of waiting, a quiet, fearful vigil held in the house I'd been banished from. David moves through the rooms like a ghost, his shoulders permanently hunched with the weight of the unknown. I did the only things I knew how to do. I made pots of strong coffee and pots of weak tea. I cooked simple, comforting foods, a creamy potato soup, a baked pasta, things that could be eaten without much thought and would sustain a body through worry. I answered the phone when it rang, taking messages from concerned friends, building a buffer between my son and the well-meaning world. Linda stayed mostly on the sofa or in bed, her face pale against the pillows, her silence louder than any outburst. The woman I'd seen as a fortress of judgment was now a landscape of quiet terror, and all my old resentments toward her melted away, replaced by a fierce, protective pity. We didn't talk about the past. The past was a luxury we couldn't afford. Our shared present was the ticking clock, the dreaded call from the doctor. I was folding laundry in the guest room, a room that had once been my sewing room, a lifetime ago, when David appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me, his arms crossed. "You didn't have to come," he said. But the words lacked their old defensive bite. They were just a statement of fact, tinged with a wonder he couldn't quite conceal. I smoothed a wrinkle from one of his shirts. Where else would I be? He was silent for a long moment. I could feel him wrestling with something, the gears of his heart turning slowly, stubbornly, after a long decade of rest. After the argument, he began, his voice low. "After you left, I got a job. 2 weeks later. It was a step down, a pay cut, but it was work." I stopped folding, my hands stilling on the soft cotton. I didn't look at him, afraid to break the spell. "I didn't know that either," I whispered. "I thought—" "I know what you thought.
he said. "I wanted you to think it. I wanted you to feel guilty. I wanted you to regret it." He let out a long, shuddering breath, and when you didn't call, when the months turned into years, the regret started to eat me alive instead. But by then, the pride, it was like a cage I'd built around myself. I didn't know how to get out. It was the most he had ever given me. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession. He had been a prisoner too. We were both jailers and inmates in the same terrible prison. The phone rang, shrill and definitive from the kitchen. David's eyes snapped to mine, wide with pure, undiluted fear. The moment of shared vulnerability shattered, replaced by the imminent verdict. "I'll get it," I said, but he was already moving, striding toward the kitchen. I followed him, my own heart hammering. He picked up the receiver. "Yes, this is David." His back was to me, his entire body rigid. I watched the line of his shoulders, waiting for them to either collapse or relax. He listened for what felt like an eternity, nodding, saying, "I see," and "okay," in a low, professional voice that belied the tension thrumming through him. Finally, he said, "Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much." He hung up the phone carefully, precisely, and then he leaned forward, bracing his hands on the kitchen counter, his head bowed. I didn't dare speak. I didn't dare breathe. He turned around. His face was streaked with tears, but he was smiling, a tremulous, disbelieving, glorious smile. "It's benign," he choked out. "The biopsy, it's benign." The air rushed from my lungs in a sob of relief. He took 2 stumbling steps across the kitchen and fell into my arms. He was a man again, not a scared boy, but he held on to me as if he were, his body shaking with the force of his deliverance. I held him. My son, really. Held him for the first time in over 10 years, and I felt the bars of our mutual cage begin to bend. Not break, but bend, letting in a sliver of light. Over his shoulder, I saw Linda standing in the hallway, having heard the news, her hands clasped over her mouth, her own body trembling with relief. Her eyes met mine over David's shaking back, and in them I saw not just gratitude, but a dawning, hesitant acceptance. The war was over. There were no winners, only survivors, weary and scarred, standing together in the wreckage, ready to begin the long, slow work of rebuilding. The relief that washed through the house was a tangible thing, a warm, golden light that seemed to melt the cold fear that had coated every surface. We sat together in the living room, the 3 of us, not saying much, just breathing in the new, clean air of their reprieve. David held Linda's hand, his thumb absently stroking her knuckles, a simple gesture of intimacy that felt like a miracle to witness. I made more tea, and this time, it tasted like hope. Later, after Linda had gone to bed, exhausted from the emotional torrent, David and I remained at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had so many meals when Michael was small. The overhead light was off, leaving us in the soft glow of the stove light, a quiet intimacy settling over us. He stared into his mug, his expression pensive. "When that phone rang," he began, his voice rough, "my first thought wasn't about the test results. It was that I needed you to be here, that I couldn't do it without you." He looked up at me, his eyes clear and unguarded. All that time, all those years I spent being so angry, I was just lonely. The admission hung in the air between us, so honest and raw, it stole my breath. I was lonely too, David, every single day. He nodded, accepting this. "I don't want to be lonely anymore, Mom." The word, spoken with such deliberate softness, was the final brick removed from the wall. We had spent a decade building it, and in a single, fear-filled week, it had crumbled to dust. I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through mine, his grip strong and sure. We sat like that for a long time, in the quiet kitchen, not as adversaries, not as estranged mother and son, but simply as 2 people who had finally, mercifully found their way home. The following morning, I prepared to leave. My purpose there was over. The crisis had passed, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding could begin. As I was zipping my suitcase, there was a soft knock on the guest room door.
It was Linda. She looked tired but peaceful, her face softer than I had ever seen it. "Helen," she said, holding out a small velvet box. "I wanted you to have this." Puzzled, I took it and opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of white silk, was a delicate silver locket. I recognized it instantly. It was the one I had given David for his high school graduation, a place to put a picture of his girlfriend at the time. He must have given it to her. "He told me you gave this to him," Linda said, her voice steady. "I've always kept it. I thought you might like it back. As a new start." I looked from the locket to her face, and I saw the effort it had taken for her to offer this, not just as a peace offering, but as a symbol of inclusion. She was giving me back a piece of my son's history, and in doing so, she was weaving me back into the fabric of their present. "Thank you, Linda," I said, my throat tight. "It's beautiful." I didn't hug her. The bridge between us was still new and its boards were thin, but we shared a look, a long, silent understanding that the past was finally, truly behind us. David drove me to the airport. The silence in the car was comfortable now, a companionable quiet between two people who no longer needed to fill the space with words to prove they existed. At the departure curb, he helped me with my bag. He pulled me into a firm, full embrace, the kind that holds nothing back. "I'll call you," he said into my hair. "I know you will," I replied, smiling. I walked into the terminal, the silver locket a cool, comforting weight against my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew he was watching, and I knew, for the first time in 10 long years, that he was watching me go with love, not with relief. The flight home felt different. The world below wasn't a place I was escaping to, but a place I was returning from, a place where my family waited. When I unlocked my cottage door, the silence welcomed me. It was my silence again, a chosen piece, not an imposed sentence. I placed the locket on the mantel next to the graduation photo. A circle closed. A story not ended, but beautifully, mercifully begun anew.